Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. If it's Monday, it must be Pablo Torre. Pablo, welcome.
Hello, I'm coming to you from nature. And by
Nature.
that I mean I am just outside of New York City, which is very adventurous for me these days.
Exactly. Anything with green is nature if you spend most of your time in Manhattan. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, don't encounter any bears or wildlife while you're out there, I'm sure. Let's talk about a huge financial deal, which is the NFL and ESPN kind of combining forces in a way. Sounds like ESPN is going to get a new junior partner in the NFL, and the NFL is going to get some of ESPN. Talk to us a little bit about the deal and whether you think it is going to change anything either about ESPN or about the NFL or about sports watching.
Yeah, I think the latter question I'll take first because this is a deal that's been rumored for a while. We've
Yeah.
expected this to happen. And in terms of what will it do in terms of being a radical change to ESPN, I think the framework to understand this is through the lens of what it's been like to watch ESPN over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, which is to say, it is already so deeply immersed in football, Jen. So the whole idea of like how does it affect your viewership as a consumer? Well, just know that already the incentive structure has already been to give you as much football as possible because it's the lone monoculture in American life, because it's the number one sport in America, because it rates. So that's sort of like the as a fan, will you notice part. The other stuff, though, that's fascinating to me and is radically different is that, yeah, the NFL is going to get up to a 10% equity stake in ESPN, which is a partnership with a media company, arguably the channel, the media organization that covers it more thoroughly than any other. At a time when the NFL has always been trying to seemingly, at least over the last, again, 5 to 10 years, they have been routinely trying to get rid of NFL Network, NFL Media, their internal media arm, which is to say that they wanted out of the media business, but they still value a real, if not a 10% hand on the scale, certainly an intimacy with a thing that they have to grapple with all of the time, which is their public reputation and how they're discussed and how they are covered. And so ESPN will get Red Zone, ESPN will get some NFL games to be sure. It's a massive deal that then raises a follow-up question, Jen, which is, okay, 10% of ESPN. Well, then the question is, what is ESPN worth? And I would say back of the envelope right now, I don't know, I guess $20 billion, give or take, but hard to say. But these are all the
Right.
questions that the biggest, I mean, it's just an enormous deal between the biggest sports media player and the biggest American sports league. So familiar in contours on one hand, radical on another.
Now, the NFL has not been, shall we say, free of controversy, particularly of late. ESPN is a media organization. They are supposed to cover the NFL. Are you concerned that the coverage won't be quite as exacting now that they are partially owned by the people they are covering? This seems like a little bit of a conflict.
It is a question that immediately comes to the forefront of my mind as someone who has been on ESPN for the last 13 years as a
Yeah.
journalist. It is also, I presume, the last thought that the deal makers had when it came to striking this agreement. If you look at the evolution of, and this is just a larger now macro observation, Jen, around what's getting funded. There's a reason why my show was launched independently and is investigative and journalism driven and covers the NFL as rigorously as I think anyone could hope to, without getting sued by a very powerful lobbying and legal arm. I would say that ESPN the magazine, which hired me to ESPN, tellingly no longer exists. ESPN.com has a couple of really good investigative reporters. To jump inside of their minds is a bit of psychotherapy that I am not
Yeah.
necessarily equipped to do, but I would be asking the very question that you asked. The question of how ESPN has always operated, by the way, even at its most robust journalistically. Biggest newsroom, I believe, at last check in terms of just like sports media, although the New York Times Athletic is probably somewhere close at this point, but ESPN globally, nothing really touches it in that regard. ESPN has always had to have this permeable, semi-permeable membrane between business, as in we pay the NFL billions of dollars, and the newsroom. right? Which is there
Right.
to cover it as you described, as rigorously as you could possibly cover anything. It's always been delicate. I would say it is ever more fragile and imperiled just because I don't understand how you do this deal without that part being affected.
And I always go back to the entertainment media, which I worked in for a while. And it's really interesting what happened there. You have the trades, which would be the Hollywood Reporter and Variety, and they've become like PR, sheets for the big media companies. So just like you said, if you want real reporting, you have to go to something that's a bit more independent. And thank goodness there's the Athletic, but it also raises the question, a lot of other big media operations, see Washington Post, don't have sports reporting anymore. So it's again in the political world, we're losing local journalism. In a sense, we're losing competing sports journalism that's completely independent, which is thank God while we have people like Pablo Torre. But
Well,
it's a problem.
oh, look, I just was noticing, right? Like Sally Jenkins leaves the Washington Post. Sally Jenkins, who's one of the
Yes.
great sports reporters of all time, the daughter
Yep.
of Dan Jenkins, himself a legend in the business, going to the Atlantic. You have these newsrooms owned. I mean, look, here's the story of this story, right? What happens when ownership from the very highest levels makes a decision that reflects a commitment not to the thing that
Yes.
your organization used to be really distinguished by, but to the sort of capitalism that is clearly more, let's just call it very, very frankly, it's just cash. Follow the
Yes.
money. I mean, look,
Yeah.
it's just, and media has always needed, the backing of some sort of real good business to support its ambitions, but this is how the sausage is made, and now the NFL and ESPN are displaying that to a really, really stark degree.
And that's why I'm sitting where I am, and that's where you're sitting where you are, because there is this kind of too big to fail, too big to criticize, too big to be perfectly independent. You and I grew up in an era where we thought, oh, wow, if media is really big, then they can't be bought, they can't be sold, they can't be influenced. Whoops. Maybe
You
that
know,
wasn't the case.
and what's really tough is that there are still real journalists at ESPN, real shows that
Yes.
want to critique the NFL, and I'm sure will do so. But there are these edge cases, right? When it comes to what happens when there is a story that the business partner really considers important for the audience to not know.
Yes. Yes,
And
exactly.
and so again, day to day, when you're talking about the Cowboys, yes, they'll still celebrate and criticize the Cowboys. Yes, they'll still celebrate and criticize coaches and players and all of the bread and circus stuff you will get. I'm sure, in fact, it'll be bolstered by a bunch of NFL Network people who are terrific at talking about football. But those real imperiling the business questions,
Yeah.
the real stuff of I would say envelope pushing compromise. That's where I just think that's really hard to expect when your boss now owns 10%. Sorry, when the NFL now owns 10% of the company that employs you. I think that's just logic. And
Exactly.
and I get it. Last thing, I get why ESPN, the business side, is doing this. Like
Yeah.
as a pure money driven
Oh, it's genius.
consequence. It makes total sense. ESPN is now entwined with the NFL. The NFL is the safest harbor in media, period. So getting your most favored nation status from your most important client unto eternity via a 10% stake, Jen, I get it. I get why
I,
Disney did it. It's just the downstream is where we happen to be paddling as independent journalists.
exactly. And oh, by the way, in the process, they got rid of a competitor insofar as the NFL media was a competitor, not
That's
much of
right.
one, but anyway. So another big deal. There was the first vote. There's going to be a second vote in Washington, D.C. on the Commanders' new stadium. I have to say, and it's not just because I live in DC, I feel a little bit different about this deal, in part because it does what so many other stadium deals don't do. And that is, it includes housing, it includes recreation, it includes other things. So it's not as if DC is putting all of its money just in like a stadium that's going to hire popcorn vendors, for lack of a better explanation. At the same time, there's a part of me that says, and they're not going to pay property tax for 30 years. So there's this tension. What do you think is unique about this deal, and what do you think is pretty much standard fare for stadium deals?
Yeah, standard fare is that it's always capitalism until there's a convenient socialism for the billionaires who don't want to pay full freight.
Yes,
That is the
exactly.
story of sports. Josh Harris is a guy that I've covered before. He owns the Philadelphia 76ers, owns the Devils in the NHL. He is described by one New York Times headline, I recall quite vividly, as a private equity prince. Apollo Global Management. This is his background, right? He knows how to
Yeah.
make deals. He is very well versed in how to do this smartly. So I believe, I have to really dig into the evolving. Again, this is not yet. There's another vote, I believe. There's a
Yes.
pathway
Yes.
here, right? So I reserve full commentary and reporting until I see how it all shakes out. But I believe that he will do this in a sophisticated way that will involve what is a very sort of standard, let's call it savvy billionaire sports owner move, which is you don't just buy the stadium, you develop the whole area around it,
Right.
right? And so that is housing, that is, consumer, let's call it consumer designed, little bits of, shops and malls and restaurants and all of that stuff. The land value goes up, right? So on the aggregate sense, I can see why this is appealing, right? To move back
Yes.
to the area formerly known as RFK Stadium. But I believe that the stuff that is always going to matter, the devil, as it were, is in those details. Who's
Correct.
paying? Who's
Correct.
paying for it? Who is
Yeah,
paying for it, and how much?
exactly. And ultimately, does I say the city of DC, we're kind of this weird city district, do they get more than they give up? Is the additional housing, the recreation, the jobs, does that on one hand cut it when we've not only given them, a lease, but a tax break that is worth a huge amount of money. And the problem is it's really hard for the public to evaluate this, particularly prospectively, because you don't know kind of how the dollar and cents are going to add up.
Yeah, the mixed use development concept, right, allows you to
Yeah.
just sort of wave a bunch of stuff on this hand and then say, and by the way,
Yes.
over here, we need a couple decades of tax breaks, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And oh, by the
exactly.
way, over here, we kind of need Donald Trump to give his blessing to this,
Yeah,
And so there are
exactly.
always strings. I'm not saying that this is going to be, as we've talked about before, a World Cup stadium in Brazil. I don't know if I am that pessimistic about what they're going to engineer here, but
Yeah,
I do know that the fine print lost in that tends to be the best interests of the taxpayers. That
absolutely.
tends to be how this goes.
Absolutely. So let's radically shift to a whole different sport, which is golf. This past week, Cameron Young, who's a very good golfer, who's always been in the top ranks, finally won his own first tournament. First tournament. So you got to kind of say, on one hand, wow, what tenacity to play that long and finally win a tournament. But that's golf. You can make a very nice living and never win, frankly. But
Yeah.
what is coming up is something that didn't exist a few years ago. And that is, in essence, these playoff rounds of golf, culminating in the FedEx, where you have 3 consecutive weeks and the field gets narrower and narrower, and the winner gets a huge pot of money. This is kind of the NFLization, the NLBization of golf. I never thought they would do this, but they figured out a way to have a postseason golf. Is that right?
Yeah, the macro big picture thing you should understand, if you're listening to this and you're like, why is this happening? Just know that there is no more valuable property in sports programming than a playoff.
Yeah.
It's the thing that is the highest stakes and therefore the highest viewership. And if these leagues could create everything out of merely the postseason, they would. And in fact, they have
Yeah.
tried,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the NBA, these long series
Yeah.
at the end of
Endless.
an endless regular season, it's because those are the most money-making products that a
Right.
sport has. The NFL, their whole competitive advantage, you could argue, is that their regular season feels like the postseason. And the NBA's, by contrast, their regular season feels like the preseason. You're
Yes.
always trying to get to the postseason. Major League Baseball as well, right? You sort of tune in, you clock in when the playoffs start. So golf has been different, obviously, because, and this is why it's so charming on the one hand, it's that you have these tournaments that are in these historical sites full of tradition, for
Yes.
whom winning that trophy is itself something like a championship. In fact, it is a
Right.
major championship. And so
Right.
trying to do both, having a major championship schedule while also generating out of thin air this postseason, it makes me think that the postseason will not nearly be as effective, but it will be worth it
Correct.
because it's a new product that people will watch.
Correct.
No history, but some more eyeballs, just way fewer eyeballs than the British, US Open, the Masters, blah, 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 PGA, all that down the line.
Right. And we sometimes forget how valuable golf is to broadcasters and cable and the rest because their audience is so valuable. That's why
Oh
they
my
have all those
gosh.
luxury car commercials and the Rolex commercials and the luxury cruise things. It's a very wealthy audience because let's face it, golf is kind of a rich man's sport with some exceptions, but it has traditionally been that. And so the people watching are big consumers.
It's such a great point. When I was at Sports Illustrated, Jen, I used to marvel. Again, I didn't grow up a big golf fan. My dad loves golf. I don't play. I'm from, again, a place without trees, typically,
Yeah.
like this. So I was at Sports Illustrated as a fact checker, and I would open the magazine up, and there would be a giant insert section called Golf Plus. I'd be
Yep.
like, wait a minute. The NFL doesn't have this. The NBA doesn't have this. Baseball doesn't have this. Why does golf get a special insert magazine? And then someone explained to me at Sports Illustrated, look at the advertisers. And it's
Exactly.
all the luxury, it's everything you said, luxury car companies, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a marketing advantage. It's that
Absolutely.
demographic. And so let us not forget that not all eyeballs are created equal. Golf
Exactly.
has the highest price point eyeballs that they can monetize. And this all makes sense for that reason.
Absolutely. And we'll end on one of my favorite sports, which is tennis. Speaking of Rolex commercials, you cannot watch a tennis tournament now without nonstop Rolex ads. Tennis is only slightly more small d democratic than golf. But we're in the midst of something called the American Hardcourt season, which is this rush of tournaments leading up to the US Open. And right now you have a women's tournament in Montreal, a men's tournament in Toronto. They've expanded that, but they're rushing forward. So they have a final on a Thursday. Why? Because they have to rush to Cincinnati, where I will actually watch some of them play, in order to get
Wow.
that in before they get to the US Open. So tennis is also making an effort to jam more stuff in. But I think one of the things that's really helping them see WNBA, see other sports, is the women's game. And that's what's so fascinating. You have this gigantic influx of young women. We used to think Coco Gauff was young. She's like a middle-aged woman now compared to, the phenom Mowoko from Canada, who is 18, and over and over and over again. It really is, I think, a tribute, and maybe you can speak to the larger issue of women's sports, how much women's sports matters now, and how
Oh
much of
yeah.
the tennis explosion is fueled by women's tennis.
Absolutely. The biggest trend line I've been reporting on and monitoring has been women's sports going from an alleged social cause to
Yeah.
just a business, which is
Yeah,
the ultimate compliment in the market that we all live in, right? So to
exactly.
me, women's tennis has always, I mean, look, you could go back and certainly think of the superficiality that fueled a lot of the attention. The Anna Kournikova, for instance, even
Yes,
Sharapova, who was excellent, but still
right.
there was a beauty standard for a lot of
Correct.
women that the Williams sisters, of course, shattered and broke open and all of that. But even still, I would say that women's tennis, even beyond that, has always been a bit of a standard bearer among the sports in terms of just like crossing over to mainstream attention. And so,
Absolutely.
how do you, as women's tennis, having that history, how do you then maximize that historical leverage at an era when the WNBA, by the way, as we speak, they are renegotiating their collective bargaining agreement and they are wearing
Absolutely.
shirts that say, pay us what you owe us. We
Yeah.
talked about this on the last episode of my show, and you have these owners who are now, it's so interesting, right? This is parallel to everything, the stakeholders, the money people behind the sports. It's always great to trumpet how successful things are going until you got to negotiate what you're going to pay the employees.
Yes.
And then you're like,
And then it's
whoa.
poverty.
And then we're like,
Oh, we
well, we're
barely
losing
scraped the bottom.
money. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no hope for us except
Yeah.
otherwise the other side again, over here, they're losing money. Over here, there are $1 billion WNBA franchises coming up. And
All right.
so women's tennis, Jen, I mean, you're better versed in it than me, but this is the same sort of path that they are walking. How do you make something, again, speaking of the golf stuff, how do you make new products that you can monetize that get these women what they are earning?
Well, and the ultimate, I think, compliment for women, and one of the advantages tennis has is that the tournaments, many of them are men and women, which says people are willing to pay the same price to go see
Totally.
Coco Gauff as they are to see Yannick Sinner. As you say, money is the ultimate compliment and the ultimate measure in sports, unfortunately, but that's what makes it go as well.
Yeah, and by the way, US Open's coming up. And that, look, in terms of just like, hey, I'm a fan of sports in general. I dare someone to find a tennis fan who's like, I'm not interested in the women's final tonight. It's like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no, we are extremely interested in that in Flushing Meadows. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. A great experience. Listen, Pablo, it's always great talking to you. Enjoy the outdoors, those things called trees in
I
back of you.
know.
Yes, the greenery. When you're, sneezing from the pollen and all the rest of it, you can go back to Manhattan where it's nice and congested and noisy and, polluted and so on. But
I'm headed home there soon. I'm a wimp, Jen. I'm a wimp.
exactly, exactly. All right, listen, take it easy. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.